I made the mistake last summer of trying to clean a particular part of our beautiful church building. And I mean really clean it, a deep clean, a complete reset. And what I learned is that when you get rid of all of the contents and you move all the things, when you really go in, you learn something about the nooks and crannies of Judson. And what I learned about this particular part of our beautiful church, on the micro level, on the particulate level, Judson is mostly either glitter or mouse poop. Glitter because, as Reverend Micah Busey has taught us so many times, we are fracking fabulous, and we need to, quote, be the glitter we wish to see in the world. And mouse poop because, well, the term church mice didn't come out of nowhere. Glitter and mouse poop. One is a particulate we take great pride in. It's something we love about ourselves. We adhere it to as many things as we possibly can, from our fingernails to our protest signs. Sometimes we even mix it in with our Ash Wednesday ashes, and don't worry, I'm talking about the glitter. But then there's the mouse poop. Something we wish wasn't there. Something that I, as a Judson staff member, to be honest, am hesitant to draw your attention to. Something perhaps you now wish you didn't know. But they are both there, both mouse poop and glitter. And weirdly, in reading our two testimonies over the last few weeks, this combination has resonated with me. I've been wondering, along with our testimonies, wondering along with Mark and genius poet Lucille Clifton about the good and the bad within us, about our failures and successes. And in light of those failures, how we can give up, or, as St. Aaliyah used to sing, we can dust ourselves off and try again, try again. Today's ancient testimony comes from the end of chapter 8 of Mark. It's wedged between two other stories where Peter is the main character. Right before today's passage, Jesus asks his disciples who people say that he is. One says John the Baptist, one says Elijah, another says one of the prophets. Good guess. So Jesus asks them, "Who do you think that I am?" And Peter says, "The Messiah." And Peter gets it right. Then Jesus tells the disciples not to tell anyone because this is movement-building justice work and Rome has COINTELPRO too. But if I were Peter, at this moment, I would feel pretty awesome about myself. I would probably feel the kind of joy I got as a child at Pasumsic Community Baptist Church when I got one of those little gold stars for successfully reciting that week's Bible verse. You know, that pride you feel when you get something right. But then we get to today's passage in Mark. Jesus tells the disciples that he will suffer many things and be killed, and in 3 days will rise again. And Peter, high off his success only verses ago, messes up big time. He rebukes Jesus. Immediately, Jesus rebukes Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Oof. Satan, ouch. Peter messes up. And this is how. He has this idea of who the Messiah is. One who will conquer Rome with military might, who will liberate with the sword. A Messiah who would never be mocked or tortured or killed. Peter got caught up in being right, so Jesus had to tell him about himself. As Reverend Dr. Valerie Holly taught us last week, Satan's role in the beginning of Mark is as a tempter who tempts Jesus with power and glory. In today's passage, 7 chapters later, Peter reprises Satan's role to again tempt Jesus with power instead of persecution. And Jesus knows what to say when, in the wisdom of the mothers of the Black church, he declares, "Not today, Satan, not today." Simon Peter becomes Satan Peter. And it's here, in Peter's previous success and present failure, that we get a picture of what a disciple looks like. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong. And I think we can see ourselves in Peter because we too are awesome and we too mess up. Right after today's passage, Peter will go on to ascend to the mountaintop with Jesus to witness his transfiguration. Then, in a few short weeks, he'll deny knowing Jesus 3 times before the cock crows. And then he'll go on to spread Jesus' message of love across space and time. My suspicion is that, like Peter, we too are guaranteed to succeed and fail again. What do we do with that? I must admit that my Lutheran fiance is rubbing off on me. In her tradition, they see all people as sinners and saints. And I think that's kind of what Lucille Clifton is implying in our modern testimony. That, quote, "It's too easy to think of the Bible people as mythological, saintly folk." To Clifton, quote, "It's much more interesting that these were humans caught up in a divine plan, but human. That seems to be the miracle," says Clifton. One of the things I so appreciate about Lucille Clifton's poetry is that she is a truth teller. Using few words, little punctuation, and lowercase letters, she cuts through the crap and tells the truth. About racism, about sexism, about people she both loves and hates, about characters like Lucifer and Lucille, about people like Moses and Medgar and Mary. In the first stanza of her poem, Wishes for Sons, Clifton writes the following: "I wish them cramps. I wish them a strange town and the last tampon. I wish them no 7-Eleven. Lucille Clifton recognizes the faults in the people she loves, the faults in our Bible characters, and the faults in herself. She excavates small mercies within devastating tragedies. She proclaims the truth of lynchings and sexual abuse and her body's fight with cancer and the evil of our indifference to suffering. And yet, she insists on that possibility of good in all of us. Should we, quote, face up to our responsibility and the possibility of evil in us? This both and appears in her poetry about Jesus and the disciples, too. In her poem, The Calling of the Disciples, she proclaims the abject foolishness of discipleship. And then in her poem, Questions and Answers, calls us towards it, writing, "You are like me, understanding the surprise of Jesus, his rough feet planted on the water lapping his toes and holding them. You are like me, like him perhaps, certain only that the surest failure is the unattempted walk." The surest failure is the unattempted walk. I think there's some truth for us here. Let's go back to Mark for a minute. As Reverend Dr. Holly mentioned last week, Mark is one of 3 synoptic gospels. Synoptic meaning seen together because they're quite similar. For New Testament scholars, this creates the synoptic problem, where they try to figure out the relationship between these similar texts. And we don't actually know for sure, but many of these scholars argue that Mark is the oldest of the 3 gospels. They suggest even that the writers of Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark and made edits and additions of other material they had to best tailor these Jesus stories to their own communities. We've talked about Mark ad nauseum, but I want to take a second to look at this story in Matthew and Luke. In Luke's version, Peter guesses that Jesus is the Messiah. Luke's Jesus goes on to share that he will be killed and rise again, but there's no rebuke of Peter whatsoever, and no reference to the shameful and sinful generation we find at the end of Mark's story either. Then there's Matthew's version of today's story, which includes Jesus' rebuke of Peter. But interestingly, before we get to that part, Matthew adds a whole section about how awesome Peter is, with Jesus proclaiming Peter as the rock of the church, Jesus proclaiming that Peter is given the kingdoms to the heaven, and kingdom is given the keys to the kingdom, and the power to bind and loose on earth and in heaven. So, what story of Peter are we going to tell? What story of our church are we going to tell? What story of ourselves are we going to tell? Will we be Luke's Peter, who didn't ever say that messed up thing, doesn't ever get rebuked, pretends the failure or the mouse poop or the white supremacy isn't there? Will we be like Matthew's Peter, masking our mistakes in the political cred of our social justice history, or in our overeducated ability to use all the right words, even when we say all the wrong things? Look, I think all 3 of these gospels are true, but I find Mark's version refreshing. It's the one where Peter is simply both right and wrong, a disciple rebuked and then called again into discipleship. Peter is both fresh from failure and on the edge of glory. As a church, we have done good work, and we have made mistakes. But most importantly, we have so much work to do. And I suspect that if we are doing church right, and if we continue to be human, that work's not going away anytime soon. If it looks like we're done, it's probably because we've silenced the truth tellers or swept the poop under the rug. If it looks like we're done, it's probably because we've written a revisionist history that focuses on the good things to make the bad look better. So here we are, Judson. It's the second week of Lent. Maybe we've already returned to the things we emphatically gave up a week and a half ago. I certainly have. Maybe we've become convinced by that first failure that we have given up on Lent or on ourselves entirely. Maybe we're so focused on our faults that we need to be reminded of our awesomeness. Or maybe we're succeeding brilliantly, getting all the gold stars. And also maybe getting a little too pleased with ourselves. Glitter encrusted or not, mouse poop is still mouse poop. Success and failure, rebuke and renewal, mouse poop and glitter, This is Peter's story, and it's our story too. But these stumbling blocks, whether they be shame-filled or pride-induced, aren't the end of our story. It's only 2 more weeks until daylight savings starts. And the seasonally affected among us are ready for rebirth. We're willing to move beyond the shame of disappearing for 4 months and ready to be called back to the things that give us life. It's only 2.5 weeks until Ravi's next check-in at Immigration and Custom Enforcement. And it matters so little whether you or I were at the last one. What matters is that we'll be at the next one, and that we will be there, as Reverend Busey reminds us, in our bold, brilliant, bedazzled beauty. It's only 4 weeks until Palm Sunday, when Jesus, instead of asking the Pentagon for a military parade, will enter Jerusalem on a donkey. Instead of worshiping the AR-15, Jesus will enter Jerusalem unarmed, knowing he is going to die. It's only 5 weeks until Easter, which is pretty much the biggest come to Jesus moment of the year. And I would argue, Judson, that we all have a stake in resurrection. Not just for Jesus, but for ourselves, for our church, and for our world. As Lucille Clifton writes in her collection, Good Woman, you might as well open the door, my child. The truth is furiously knocking. Amen, Lucille. Amen.